Recording in progress. Got it. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. There are 142 of us. It'd be nice if we were all gathered together in Neville Hall. One day that'll happen again, but not today. However, today we are very fortunate to have a synchronous lecture given by Dr. Adam Crowley, who is a professor of English and a director of composition at Hudson University. He got his BA with highest honours in English from the University of Maine, and his MA.
I went back.
Oh, correcting me?
Wasn't me.
It wasn't you. Sorry, somebody said something. His MA in English from the University of Maine and his PhD, also in English, from the University of New Brunswick. Dr. Crowley's research interests are video games and digital rhetoric, and his special interests include Gothic literature. Well, we're very lucky to have him teaching with us in honours and also lecturing for us this afternoon on the Golden Ass. I know that my preceptor is very much looking forward to this lecture. I'm sure everybody else is. So with no more ado, over to Adam, Dr. Crowley.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to speaking with you over the next hour and a half on the subject of the Golden Ass. I'm going to attempt to share my screen real quickly, so please let me know if that works.
It works.
Start my slideshow here. Okay, great. So here we are. And so the title of this lecture is Context and Controversies. My main goal over the next few hours, next hour or so, is to provide context for your discussions in the preceptorials, as well as to provide some specific arguments that relate to both the text and our translation of the text, the Graves translation. I think there's a lot to be said about both of those things, and a lot of ideas we can use to help expand on the work we've already undertaken in the honor sequence so far. So one thing I am going to kind of indicate is if people would like to, I have to make this smaller here. Here we go. If people would like to take the conversation on this book kind of outside the magic circle that all universities have, I'm suggesting the hashtag Appalachian 2022. So if people wanted to have a conversation on Twitter or Snapchat or something like that, that would be one way to tag those comments elsewhere, should you feel any interest in doing such a thing, either today or in the near future. So that's there as well. All right, let's see if I can get this to work. So to get things started, I want to get a bit of a reality check. And Katie, this is one of the first links that I shared with you. In the chat, there's going to be a link to a Google form I'd like you to chime in with, just to indicate how much of the work, I'm not going to call it a novel yet, the work you have completed so far. So if you can follow that link in the chat, you'll see that you have the options of selecting the first 6 books or 9 books or 12 books or the first 19 books. I just want to get a sense of where we are with respect to the narrative. So we'll just take a minute or two to let people do that. Hopefully that's fairly straightforward for everyone. I'm definitely going to be talking about the whole narrative in different ways, so there will be spoilers and things like that for the in this lecture. Just take another couple of moments to wrap that up. It's not absolutely imperative, but I would like to get a sense of where we are. So another 10 or so seconds maybe. Okay, hopefully everyone's been able to do that and to record that. To get started, regardless of where you are with the narrative, rather than have me summarize it for you, I'd like to offer an exercise where you think about the material that you are familiar with. And so, Katie, if you could provide that second link now in the chat, what I'm going to ask you to do in a moment is to follow that link and take 3 or 5 minutes, this is not a quiz, to reflect on the material that you've read so far, and to the best of your ability, summarize that material. This is intended as a free write activity, which some of you may be familiar with, so don't worry about things like grammar or syntax or mechanical issues. Just put down the words that come to mind as they come to mind to summarize what you can remember of the document in terms of what you've looked at so far. Okay, and I'm still providing an opportunity on that Google form. It's about a paragraph length response. Doesn't have to be that long, but just think about the aspects of the text that are really sticking in your mind and share those. Okay, and this is just an effort to refresh our minds and think about the document before we get into a serious conversation about it. So set aside, I said 5 minutes, but let's take 3 or 4. I don't want this to go on too long. 3 or 4 minutes to summarize your memories of the document as you experience it so far.
Okay, so I can't.
If you're not able to access it, that's okay. If anyone shouldn't be able to access it, you might just record the paragraph for yourself. And if you want to email it to me later, that's totally fine.
Yeah.
And if you're joining late, we're just following that second link, in the chat, with an opportunity here to summarize our memory of the text as we've explored it so far. Take about another minute and a half here. Another 30 or so seconds. As we're wrapping this up, one of the fundamental reasons why I'm doing this right now is not just to simply jog our memory as it relates to the text before we dive into it, but because I want to underline the significance of what it means to be an author and to also be accountable for a work, to be accountable for a text. That is a concept that will be significant to my comments on the Golden Ass and to the Graves translation. So kind of step 1. Again, briefly, we want to try something a little bit different now. So you just took a few minutes to summarize the text to the best of your ability, as best as you were able in a free writing environment. I want to provide a space for you to play with that interpretation now and perform something that normally we would push back against, which would be an effort to censor a document, or to use the term bowdlerize, to make it less offensive with respect to references to violence and sex and other kind of taboo issues, a number of which pop up in this narrative. Okay, so what I'd like you to do here, again, we'll do 3 or 4 minutes instead of 5, but I want you to think about what you just composed and shared. And I'd like you to, this is going to require a little creativity on your part, I'd like you to reimagine what you just submitted, but I'd like you to self-edit it so that the references to potentially content related to sex or violence in one form or another is removed. And you can select your own content you would like to breathe into the text that would itself not cross an imaginary line with respect to being offensive or taboo. So go back to your original summation, remove what we might term the vulgar aspects of it, if there are any references, and provide your own content or information to fill out your kind of slightly hollowed out narrative. So it's an invitation here to play with those details and to think about how you might rephrase the presentation of the text so that it's not addressing concepts that might, quote unquote, be offensive. And to get to this, there'll be a third link in the chat that I think Katie will be able to share with us. That should appear momentarily if it hasn't already. Follow that link, and let's take the next 3 or so minutes to revise and bowdlerize or purify our summation of the golden ass. Okay, and again, just quickly, 3 or so minutes for this.
There's no way to answer it. All that the form gives us is like an option button. There's no place to put anything right.
Okay. If you're unable to, if it's not working when someone logs into it, I would just say write the paragraph on your own and set it to the side for a moment. Thank you for the comment. Take another minute or so. What would a revised summation of the text look like? That was maybe treading on eggshells with his audience. Okay. And kind of finally, this is a much shorter activity. The last thing I'd like us to do, now we thought about summarizing it with respect to the text we received, summarizing it with respect to some expectations or vague values we may want to impose on the text. The last thing I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take credit for what you just did. And I'd like you to take credit for what you just did by creating an MLA, works cited citation, for each of your little summaries. Okay, I'll explain why I want to use this in a few moments as well. So what I'd like you to do is to think about how you would create a citation. What would you title? What would you title the piece of the book? Would you claim to be the translator? I'd like you to imagine, okay, some works cited citations for both of those summations. That is one for each, and how they might be distinct from each other in your own mind. They may not be distinct from each other in your own mind. That's fine. If you're looking at this right now saying, I have no idea what he's asking, just create the same MLA works cited, citation twice. That's okay. But to the best of your ability, imagine that summation that you just put down is part of a book. How would you represent that book using the conventions of the MLA citation standards? So just take a second to do that. If the link works for you and you want to submit that through the link, that's great. If the link doesn't work for you, again, just write it down, keep it on the side for a few minutes, and that's okay. And this won't take as long. We'll just take about 2 minutes for this.
I can put headphones in. I can also put in.
And as you're doing this, if you're wondering why does this matter, that is one of the things we will be addressing shortly. Okay. Just another 30 or so seconds. Okay. If you were able to submit that information, great. If you weren't, just hold on to it, and we'll talk about what to do with it in a little bit. Let's move into the lecture itself, now that we've generated those materials. This lecture, as time permits, will have 4 different sections. An initial section in which we think about context for the golden ass, literary context for the golden ass. A section in which we address the story of the story, that is where we think about how this document that you are reading came to be. We'll be thinking about Graves' translation and the limitations that we may be confronting in that translation, and I don't mean limitations necessarily in a negative way, okay? And if there is time, and there generally isn't, but if there is time, I want to turn towards the work of Northrop Frye, who provides a really good theoretical framing for this document, which could be useful not only for class discussions of this document, but also for a range of other texts you look at in your honor sequence. So that's the general trajectory of where we're going. I see the chat, I don't have the chat running, so if there's a big question that comes up and someone wants to ask me the question, it's probably okay to just ask it at this moment, because I'm not going to have split screens as I go through. I'll do my best to stop and answer your questions. So let's jump into things. Literary context for the golden ass. When we approach the question of context for documents, I think it's very important to keep in mind what we're doing in the honor sequence, which is experiencing very rapidly broad exposure to a number of works, some of which are in conversation with each other, direct conversation with each other, but a number of texts that are not in direct conversation with one another. So one of the really important notions throughout our journey in this program in the honors college is this question of how can I make connections between the different works? How can I understand the relationships, the history of ideas, the concepts that link one text to another? And with various readings, that's more or less challenging. I want to provide a very specific context for your version of the golden ass. That is, I don't want to take this lecture to make firm connections with earlier readings, Vitruvius, the Aeneid, the Odyssey, or any of the selections from Honors 111. Rather, I want to talk about the golden ass that you are reading in the context of other versions of the golden ass. Because one of the things we can see when we start to compare this document to other versions of what is essentially the same document is how meaningful translators are with respect to interpretation, how a document can be shaped in by the social conventions that are significant to its era of production, and it will raise questions for us about what it is we have actually read and what it is we have actually experienced as we make our way through this journey written down originally, supposedly by Appleus, that has landed to us through Robert Graves. Okay, so very briefly, what I want you to understand is that the early 21st century has been a kind of a renaissance period for the Golden Axe. That is, there have been a number of rapid-fire publications from a range of publishing houses. And so we have editions from the late 1990s throughout the early 2000s into the 2010s. There's a new version that just came out, I believe, last year that is yet another version of the story that I believe has some pretty significant edits, pretty significant portions of what you would experience as the original document pulled out. And so we're in a time where the Golden Axe is kind of suddenly everywhere in a little dramatic, but there are many more versions of it that are available to general readers than we've seen in the past. Okay, so that's one of the first things I would stress. As we think about these different versions and talk about them, how they relate to each other, I'll be using the conventions of MLA 8th edition citation as a reason for that. Okay, one of the reasons for using this framework is that the citation practices help us get specific about some of the details that, at least for this lecture, really matter in terms of how we conceptualize a text, how we imagine ourselves to be engaged with the text, and fundamentally what we expect and understand a text to be. So you'll be seeing some notation throughout this presentation, and that's the reason for it. For example, I'm going to select just 3 other versions of the text in addition to the one that you are reading. Someone might need to be muted, I don't know. 3 other versions of the text that if we start to dig into the record, how they are cited, we can begin to understand some really significant things about the text themselves and then the broader collection of works that are available to modern readers. So I've picked the Sarah Rudin translation from Yale University Press. I've picked the E.J. Kenny translation from Penguin, and I also have the Walsh translation from Oxford. Now, I'm not going to be digging into these texts themselves in terms of much detail, but I do want to take a few minutes to talk about where these works are coming from and why their sourcing matters, particularly when you contrast it with the version you're reading, the Robert Graves version from Farrar, Strauss, and Giroux from the mid-20th century, from 1951. If this isn't an effort to say that one is better than the other, it's an effort to say that context matters. All right? So the very first thing I want to draw your attention to is this notion of publisher, this question of where did the document come from, who published our book. Let's just step back for a little bit. And as I just mentioned, with the 4 copies that we're looking at in this presentation, we have one from Yale University Press, one from Penguin, one from Oxford University Press, and then we have the Farrar, Strauss, and Giroux press publication as well. These are very different organizations, very different publishing houses, and they produce very different versions of this story. And there's a relationship between the source of the text and what the text looks like. So, for example, if we look at something as basic as a mission statement for Yale University Press and Oxford University Press, we can immediately note some distinctions that are potentially quite relevant to the actual document we receive and review. Okay, so I know that it may be difficult to see all of my PowerPoint phrasing and wording, so I'll read it to you as best I can here. When we think about the mission for Yale University Press, we have something like the publications of the press are books and other materials that further scholarly investigation, advance interdisciplinary inquiry, stimulate public debate, educate both within and outside of the classroom, and enhance cultural life. Now, it's a very broad mandate. We might notice the significance of scholarship and scholarly investigations, and also notions of education in that mandate. If, for example, you had access to the Yale University Press version of the text and you began to investigate it, what you would find would be resources in the document that reach out to those concerns. In the Oxford University Press mission statement, we get everything we publish relates directly to our mission to support Oxford University's objective of excellence in research, scholarship, and education. So you notice the echoing there of scholarship and education for both of those publishing houses. Okay, and again, if you look at the Oxford version, you would find something quite similar in terms of resources in the document that would help facilitate those goals. If I look at the other 2 versions that I picked up and I look at their mission statements, I begin to encounter some significant differences, at least with respect to the mission statements of Yale and Oxford University Press. The Penguin piece, look at their mission. The Penguin Publishing Group is the proud publisher of great writers and gifted storytellers, beloved books, and eminent works. At Penguin, we believe that literature can fuel the imagination and guide the soul. So what's missing there in a nutshell, or what's not necessarily a shared concern, at least at the level of explicit enunciation, this relationship with scholarship and education. It's not that can't be inferred from what's being said by Penguin, but it's not front and center with the document itself. That has implications for the document that's produced. When we look at our version, this is really what I want to draw your attention to, and we think about how it presents itself to the world, we might notice a couple of things. First, it's important to say that this is a modern mission statement for this publisher and that your document comes from the early 1950s, so presumably not the same as the company had at the forefront 70 or so years ago. But anyways, let's take a second to look at it. The firm is renowned for its international list of literary fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and children's books. Farrar, Strauss, and Giroux authors have won extraordinary acclaim over the years, including numerous national book prizes, Pulitzer prizes. I'm going to stop right there because one of the things I think you can infer is that this statement is very much about elevating the identity of the author. These individuals are select, renowned, noteworthy, celebrated. So it's the celebration of the individual who has composed the text. That is significant to the mission statement they're kind of putting out in front of the world. That, again, that's quite distinct from what we've seen with Yale and Oxford and Penguin. So when I'm working with this document and I know the publisher, one of the questions I may have is, okay, how significant is the authorship and the identity of the author to the text, but in particular, the identity of the translator? Okay, Graves is a significant literary figure on his own right. And how significant is his selection based on his acclaim to the document that you are holding? That is, how much of the document you are holding is significant to Graves and not really to Appleus or not really to earlier versions of the text? That's a question I'd like you to have in the front of your mind as we get deeper into this lecture. And that leads us to a conversation about translator and thinking about who has translated the piece. And as we do this, we'll see some similarities in terms of comments that can be offered here and comments that can be offered with respect to the publisher. Okay. So Sarah Rudin is the Yale University translator, and when we look for information about Sarah Rudin, one of the things that we find is that she is eminently qualified to translate a work of Latin into English. She is an expert in the relevant fields. She has wide familiarity with the literature of the time, and she has a successful history of publishing with respect to documents that are significant to Appleus's text. So, very briefly here, she holds a PhD in classical philology from Harvard University and an MA from the Johns Hopkins Writing Seminars. She has taught Latin, English, and writing at Harvard, Yale, and the University of Cape Town. So there's that. The significance of her education to what she expresses is fairly latent. A lot of material that you would find online about Sarah Rudin. That's important to keep in mind. Very similarly, in a similar but slightly distinct way, if we were to look at someone like Walsh, who's another one of our translators, this is pulling from his obituary, I believe. But the way in which Walsh is being presented to the world is as follows. He was of the generation of working class intellectuals who were able to advance via awards of different sorts. That sounds super snotty to me, but anyway, it's a characterization that we might carry with us first at Preston Catholic College and then with a country scholarship to Liverpool University. He served in the RAF and military intelligence and so on and so forth. Now, this is pulling from an obituary, so that is in and of itself a genre that has expectations, but the sense of Walsh being an individual with a broad educational background and potentially broad experiences that make him particularly relevant to the work of translating Apuleius's document. And that's significant to how that text in that version would be or could be received. When we look at someone like Graves, we need to be made aware of a few things before we get too far into his version of the Golden Ass. And I think what we need to be aware of is kind of laid out quite well in this description of Graves from the Poetry Foundation. Okay, Graves often stirred controversy in his endeavors as a poet, novelist, critic, mythographer, translator, and editor. Stephen Spender of the New York Times Book Review characterized Graves as a free thinker. All of his life, Graves has been indifferent to fashion, and the great and deserved reputation he has is based on his individuality as a poet, who is both intensely idiosyncratic, and I want you to underline that 4 times in your mind, and unlike any other contemporary poet, and at the same time, classical. Okay, so why am I presenting that to you? I'm presenting that to you not to undermine your reading, but I'm presenting that to you to put in bold the significance of the translator as an identity associated with the work. And as we get a little bit further into this lecture, I'll talk about some particular instances where it may be very important that you are aware of Graves as an idiosyncratic author, poet, writer, and how that may influence your interpretation of the text. Okay. So again, when we take the MLA, something as dry and boring as MLA citation, and we start to pay attention to the categories, and we start to get specific about the categories, what begins to emerge is context for a document. That's particularly important for the Golden Ass, because one of the things you'll see in this lecture today is that the work itself, as it exists in time in the 2nd century, has essentially no context, essentially no recorded context. So it's a very challenging work to position as being in direct conversation with one or more other works. So when we're looking at a contemporary version, one of the things you can do is start to think about the fields at play as it is around the document, and how the different efforts to publish it and the different efforts to translate it can shape our understanding of the text in useful ways. Okay, that's really the end of the first part of my lecture. And again, so if you have some notes you're keeping, you could use those potentially for a conversation in a preceptorial or perhaps for a paper that you may be working on. I now want to get into part 2 of the lecture, which I'm calling the story of the story. And this is the part of the lecture where we'll get into some specifics about Apuleius and the document that he produced, or at least is himself associated with. In order to do that, I wanted to take just a few moments before I leave Graves entirely for 20 or 30 minutes to talk about some immediate context for the Graves translation. So earlier in the lecture, part 1, I showed you very briefly, very superficially, the idea that we have had a number of modern versions come out in the last 20 or so years. If we look back to the beginning of the 20th century, okay, we have at least 3 significant versions of the document that come out before Graves' translation. And something happens in the course of those documents and their reception that I think is really significant to why the Graves translation looks the way it does. So we have a 1905 version. Again, notice different publishers here. What I want to draw your attention to is the 1910 version, the Butler version, the H.E. Butler version. The H.E. Butler version encountered a great deal of resistance when it was first published, because the document communicated a number of the sexually charged episodes that you are encountering, for example, in the Graves translation. There was a pushback from those communities that would read the book or be invested in the book. There was resistance from English speakers at the time, from the market that the Clarendon Press was appealing to, that the work was too profane, was upsetting. That event, 1910 and onwards, had a significant impact, on how the document next came into being, which is the Jack Lindsay version in 1932. Okay, the 1932 version, when that's published, a lot of that material is either removed or dramatically toned down, taken out altogether. So there's this kind of self-editing or intentional removal of information that could be controversial to the audience the document was being broadcast to. That's significant to the Graves translation. And if you look at Graves' introduction, you'll see that Graves is intentionally kind of reaching back, not just to Butler, but beyond, with a claim of presenting the document in a way that is representative of the information that has been edited out or removed, okay, in one form or another in the Lindsay version of the text. Graves is going to claim not just that, he's going to make strong associations with the first version of the document that was published in English, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, the William Adlington version. And that's specific to the market he's reaching out to. However, if you read the introduction, you also can see that he's trying to play it safe, because he often talks about how there are other versions, other ways the stories have been told that are more profane even than his version. So he's trying to toe that line, but this document is emerging as an effort to highlight and include material that would have been removed in the recent past. I mentioned that, and then a very, very brief aside here. When we look at the modern market for the Golden Ass, the most recent version, the Peter Singer version that came out within the last year or so, is a very intentional self-edit. It removes a lot of material that would be deemed potentially offensive by different kinds of readers. So it's all this interesting give and play between versions that I want to draw your attention to. So if we step out of the 20th century, let's just think about this work for a moment in terms of English language translations, okay, and how the work has been received or not received. The first version that we get in English is in 1566. It's the William Adlington translation. This is available, I believe, in Fogler. If anybody's really interested in the Golden Ass after this lecture or as part of the reading, I would encourage you to go look at this document. You don't have to read the whole thing, but just to get a sense of how the document presents Apuleius is really fascinating. And this version, I would argue, my takeaway from Graves is that Graves may not even have tried to read the document in Latin. He may have simply taken the Adlington version and tried to update it for a modern audience. That is an unfounded accusation on my part, but it's a suspicion I have after spending some time with Graves. But anyway, the 1566 version is quite well received in terms of the document having an influence over a number of decades with a number of significant artists who I'm representing here on this timeline. So there's references in Sidney's Arcadia, there's references in Spenser's The Fairy Queen, there's references in Marlowe's Hero and Leander, a number of Shakespeare's plays reference Apuleius and the Golden Ass literally in one form or another. There's references in Othello, Midsummer's Night's Dream, Hamlet, Much Ado About Nothing. Milton also is picking up on the kind of Apuleius train a little bit later. Now, it's important to qualify here to say that I can't say with a straight face that all of these artists are responding only to an English translation version of what we're calling the Golden Ass. I can't say that, but what I can say is that the document appears and then is accessible to the audiences and the readers of these texts, okay, so that they are also able to read in English the material that is referenced in these works. So I think that's an important thing for me to stress as well. But anyway, the document first appears in English around 1566. As we'll see, that's about the same time it starts appearing in a lot of European languages in translation, in German and French and Spanish, other works as well. It's really important to understand that the Adlington and Graves translations are what I'm going to call oddball translations. again, not to undermine them, but to help position them in this extended trajectory of translators working with the golden ass. Okay, and there's at least three ways in which they are very similar. The first, and perhaps most unforgivable way in which they are both similar, is that they present Apuleius as Lucius Apuleius. So they present the story here as if Apuleius is the character you're reading about. That's an incredibly disorienting representation potentially, because that's not what's, first of all, it's not how other translators have handled it, and there's no reason to believe that that's kind of fundamentally how this text evolved. But these authors are taking this individual and they're kind of inserting him into the text as if he is a main character. That's really significant to the honors curriculum because it can undermine your understanding of how significant Dante is when you get to the Inferno in the Divine Comedy, and how significant it is that the poet in that text presents himself as an individual on that journey. If you're not paying attention, that can slide right by you in the Golden Ass. The other thing that's really important to understand is that Apuleius went on trial in his lifetime because he was accused of witchcraft, because bad readers of his work assumed that the events of the Golden Ass were real, and that it happened to him, and that it wasn't a fiction that he had spun. So, and that happens both in terms of his life, as we'll see. It's how St. Augustine characterizes him, very bizarrely. So there's this inability to distinguish fiction from real life, okay? I'm saying all this based on the assumption that an individual can be magically transformed into a jackass and then back again. I could be wrong, but it's important to be aware of that when you're working with grades. He's playing around, okay? The way in which the document is broken up at the beginning of this lecture, I asked you how far you were into the text. Those 19 breaks are arbitrary, okay? Those 19 breaks are not found in other versions of the text in the same way. You'll find a different range of breaks in different translations, but that's a characteristic that kind of unites the Addington and the Graves versions. So those choices, as well as a few others, kind of mark the documents as oddball editions of the Golden Ass. That isn't, again, I'm not saying that undermines them, but we need to be aware of that. We can gain a little bit more now if we pay attention to this notion of authorship and this notion of title, because if we start to consider the document in the context of other documents that share the same name or a similar name, a few things begin to become apparent pretty quickly. So one of the things we want to be aware of is that this document is very hard to trace to its origin. A lot of sources will confidently tell you that it's the only surviving Roman novel. That's wrong on two fronts. The first is that the source documentation doesn't exist, so it's not surviving. We'll see what that means in a second. The other is that the conflation of the word novel with the document can be quite confusing, because for most readers, the concept of the novel is definitely 15th, 16th, 17th century and beyond in terms of its development and trajectory. It's not something from 2nd century Rome, arguably. So we'll get to that in a second. But as well as it can be traced, how can it be traced? Well, Apuleius is associated with a text he titles, or someone titles, Metamorphoses. Okay, and that's a document that's created sometime during his life. So sometime between roughly 120 and 170, a document is produced. That document perhaps coincides with another document with similar subject matter, okay, associated with Lucian of Samosata. Again, it's that 120 to 170 time frame, which is essentially the assumed lifespan of the individual. In that span, we don't have dating for which came first. Okay, so is the Apuleius version first? Is the Lucian version first? That's difficult to understand. Both works share a number of similarities, but there's question of, is Apuleius like expanding on one version, a Lucian's version, or is Lucian's version already an effort to tone down what's an Apuleius version? I can't tell you with a straight face that I know the answer to that, because that's not something that appears to be known. But that 120 to 170 period is significant to the origin of the document we associate with the Golden Ass. There's a reference in a 9th century work to what is potentially an earlier document with similar subject matter associated with Lucius of Petrae, okay, that has been lost. And the implication there is that perhaps Apuleius and Lucian are responding to that earlier work. But again, that document no longer exists. So it's kind of like a shell game here. We know there are these potentially three texts circling around in history, but we can't pin them down with much accuracy. We can begin to interpret the text in a way that leads to some reasonable observations and conclusions, but it's hard to get very specific. Okay, so we have to be comfortable with that. And that's the case with a number of texts in the honors curriculum. So we've seen that before. However, one of the benefits of having multiple translations and multiple scholars looking at the document is that when we look at what they have to say about the document and we find similarities between the things that they're saying, we can start to gain some confidence in our understanding of the work. So to stress what I mean here, if we look at the Graves, the Kenny, and the Walsh translations, and I know this can be difficult to see, they all make reference to the text being in the mode of what they refer to as Milesian storytelling. They all present it as if we understand the term, as if we know what that term means. It's a really important term for us to focus on, because it can help us, once we gain some understanding of what that term means, it can help us engage with the document in productive ways. Okay. So that term comes from a document called, from around 100 BCE, so maybe 30, 40, 50 years before Apuleius drafts the text, the Milesian tale. And that's a tale characterized by surprising twists and turns, okay, and explicit material. If I was to characterize that as a modern genre, we might think about something like Pulp Fiction. I don't mean Pulp Fiction the movie. I mean cheap stories designed to be sensational, designed to entertain, to get a deep emotional reaction from the reader, produced very quickly perhaps in a modern market. But it's this idea that the document is doing everything it can to be sensational with its reader. Okay, and so Apuleius is presumably working in that tradition. This is a tradition that Ovid picks up, and Apuleius will be engaged, as we'll see with that in a second. The other thing to be aware of in terms of the shape of the story is that both Graves and Adlington, anyway, make this association between the text and Africa, or the text and Egypt. And for Graves, he uses the association with Egypt to suggest a certain kind of storytelling that is relevant to the document that we're reading. And it's detailed here, the Egyptian storytelling convention, which allows humans to be changed into animals and after various adventures restored to their proper shapes. You should be amused by this queer novel. Okay, it's an interesting statement. Then the question is, what are the stories you're referencing? Like what's that actual context that we can use to understand the document? And he doesn't actually provide it. So there's this question, well, what does it mean? What does that mean for this work and how it unfolds? Adlington also makes a brief aside to the continent of Africa, and then never revisits it. And I don't think this is worth a real detailed investigation right now in this lecture. But there's this question of why the translators characterize the works that they translate in the ways that they do, and is that supposed to be significant to how we receive the document? So, in terms of where this document comes from, it's important perhaps to know a little bit about Apuleius. We don't know a great deal, but we do know that I shouldn't say that because there are a number of works that exist and have persisted, but we don't have a lot of fine details about his life. So that's, I guess, a more accurate comment from there. We know that he's very much working in a mode of borrowing titles from other authors. So we have works that borrow titles from Plato, that play with titles from Seneca, that obviously play with titles from Ovid. In terms of the conventionality of those kinds of documents, it's interesting, particularly because he's so productive over the course of his life. That's one of the things we'll see in an upcoming slide, and we'll talk about that. But he's writing in a range of styles kind of very rapidly. He produces a significant amount of writing over the course of his life, including, as we'll see, what is supposedly another long narrative, not just like the Golden Ass, but another long narrative kind of in the mode of the Golden Ass, but that too has been lost. So we both have a great deal of work that has survived associated with this author, but then there's also a lot of work that no longer exists that's associated with this author. I've brought this slide up just if you're interested in the potential comparisons that can be made between our early Lucianus Amosata and Apuleius' version of the document. What are some distinctions? Well, one of the things we know that's significant to your reading is that Apuleius' version of the text appears to be the source material for the Cupid and Psyche story. Okay, that story is sourced to the Apuleius document and no further, which is significant in terms of the idea being that he may have created that story. Whether or not he did is debatable, but that's kind of the starting point for the story. Not for the conception of those characters, but for that description of their interactions. The role of Isis at the end of this text is specific to Apuleius, and there's a lot that could be said about whether we're supposed to take that as simply another example of him being a jackass, or if it is meant to be a heartfelt affirmation of a religious position, or a way in which he feels devoted to a supernatural entity. I think there's a lot of evidence from his life that suggests that that's not the case in terms of how he engaged with Isis individually. But anyway, that's significant to him. And the information about Charity and her death, that also seems to be sourced to Apuleius. The other thing that a lot of students, at least in my sections, are noting is that there's a lot of stories within stories in the Golden Ass. That is, you're frequently encountering scenes or scenarios where one person will tell a story, and then sometimes even within that story, someone else will start to tell a story. That structuring of the tale also seems to be specific to Apuleius. One of the things Graves says, which is hard to support, hard to defend, but which is important, is this idea that he probably invented none of his stories, though it is clear that he improved them. I don't see how you defend that statement. If you don't know what's been created or not created, then you can't say that it was improved, right? So anyway, that's the world that Graves is operating in. And I'm not going to read you all these necessarily, but a moment ago I indicated that Apuleius had an enormous output over the course of his life. So you can see some of the modes he's working in: love lyrics, hymns, satirical epigrams, literary lectures, works of fiction, symposium literature, so on and so forth. So one of the ways I want you to think about this individual, this can be useful too in terms of the honor sequence, is here we have an author who's very rapidly moving between a number of different genres with what appears to be a great deal of success. We haven't had too many actual authors we've been able to identify and nail down and know with some detail in the honor sequence so far. So it's nice when you encounter one and you can say, okay, there's an actual human being here, and this actual human being can be associated with this kind of talent with respect to writing. So anyway, there's that information about Apuleius as well, which could be quite useful. Okay, so I am keeping an eye on time. I'm going to go until about 4:40, okay, because I won't try to cram everything in, but I'll get you to a place where hopefully you can ask some questions if you have some. All right, so when we think about the year of publication, this too is significant. This is where things get really murky really quickly. So if you thought it was murky before, kind of hold on. So one of the things I mentioned is that Apuleius' lifespan is basically 120 to 170. We know that he completes his education around 155. There's one interesting anecdote from his life. He ends up marrying a much older woman and is embroiled in an inheritance dispute later on. And it's at that point that he's accused of witchcraft for his role in the marriage. And he is vindicated in terms of that trial. But this idea that he is associated with magic as a human being, I think, is significant, particularly when you see the way St. Augustine treats him in the not too distant future, and how Graves treats him, and how Adlington treats him, and how confusing it can be to present to a reader some conception that this is who is telling the tale, who is experiencing these events. And we know that he dies in or around Carthage. We know he goes back to Carthage around 160 and spends the rest of his life there. But in terms of exact dates, we do not have them. So that's important to understand. So where does this document come from? I think probably the shadows is the best answer I can give you, because when we look back in time, what we first encounter in terms of documentation are these two works from the end of the 4th century, okay, which are understood to be revisions of earlier documents that no longer exist. The Salistius revisions are really the foundation, or the assumed foundation, for what we understand today to be the Golden Ass. So these documents appear near the end of the 4th century. These documents are received and considered by, they find their way into the hands of a number of figures who become enormously significant to the development of the Catholic Church. Most prominently St. Augustine, who you will be encountering later this semester, either in Confessions or the City of God. And this is when Augustine receives the text and starts to talk about the text, this is arguably where the text is stamped in a way that it has never kind of shaken off. And so we want to take a second to regard that and think about that. In the longer unedited version of the City of God, which I don't believe anyone's looking at in the sequence, it's enormous in scope. Augustine addresses the Golden Ass by name. And we need to talk about that because what he calls it is, certainly the title he gives it is not a title Apuleius would have understood. Okay, I want to talk about why. So in terms of what Augustine says, he references the text and says, yet their mind did not become bestial, but remained rational and human. Just as Apuleius, in the books he wrote with the title of the Golden Ass, was told or feigned that it happened to his own self. And again, when that comes up, you want to think about the history of Apuleius being associated with witchcraft during his life. And you also want to think about Adlington and Graves and their translations of the document. That happened to his own self, that on taking poison, he became an ass while retaining his human mind. So if you've read more than a few chapters of the Graves version, you are already finding yourself in opposition to St. Augustine, which may or may not be a comfortable place to be, because obviously there's no poison taking in the document that you read. Augustine's talking about a version of the text you don't have. Okay, and that should strike you as interesting in terms of how those events are related, how those events unfold. It's also really important to understand that the term golden is a loaded term. It's a loaded term, and Augustine would have understood that it was a loaded term because golden here would be used to characterize, again, kind of a sensational, kind of cheap, roughly put together work that is meant to, engage the baser senses that a human being has and entertain them. Like, I'm thinking of like Fear Factor from a number of years ago, but I don't know if any of you remember Fear Factor. But just the idea that it's an entertainment that's designed to kind of gross out, be sensational, it's kind of disposable, it's not particularly culturally significant. Again, when Apuleius writes something, assumedly he's pulling from Ovid, and he's pulling his title from there. But this is how Augustine kind of characterizes him. So we might be aware of that, and that's one of the reasons why it's so important to think about where these documents come from and why they look the way they do once they come to us. Okay, so we might think about that in our conversations. I know not everybody is into bibliomania maybe in this group, so I won't bore you with a long consideration of the text arc through the centuries, but we can think a little bit about those late 4th century Salistius revisions in terms of how they have gone on to influence our understanding of the Golden Ass. The document, basically after Augustine speaks, this is a little unfair because I'm kind of knocking Augustine here. That's not fair. But basically after Augustine speaks, a little later on, the document kind of vanishes, which isn't all that odd necessarily for documents of the time, but it vanishes for about 500 years. Okay, the revisions vanishing for about 500 years. Then around 1000, we get the Monte Cassino copies. And there's two versions of these documents. There's the F version and there's the G version, which stand in response to, as kind of copies on those earlier revisions. So the F and G versions, as they're known, come to be collected and saved at Monte Cassino, where they are themselves copied and recopied for a number of reasons you might imagine that I don't have particularly into detail in this lecture. But the copying of the text over time creates variations in the text, particularly F. F is copied a number of times, and variations creep into the document. Things are left out, things are included. It's not exactly like a game of telephone. That would be a dramatic overstatement, but there's a sense that over time, F needs to be revisited and copies need to be kind of cleaned up if the document is to be made as close as possible to the shape of the versions that show up around 1000. 1200 in that range. Okay, and that goes on for several centuries. Once you get into 1300, what you start to have are some fairly significant artists who get a hold of the document. And that begins very slowly this tradition of Apuleius' work being received by artistic communities and scholarly communities, such as those that are represented in the Oxford, Yale, Farrar, and so on, Penguin, and so on, publishing houses we considered at the beginning of this lecture. So Petrarch and Boccaccio are both familiar with the document. And right around 1500, we start to get scholarly versions of the text. So we start to get versions of the text in a number of European languages that work to make sense of where this narrative has come from. And there are different kinds of claims, there are different kinds of associations that are made along the way. And that's the context for the Adlington version, which is down here in 1566, which emerges after a Spanish version, after a German version, after a little bit after. Like I got my numbers messed up there. It comes after the Spanish version, but there are multiple versions in different languages. So there's this movement in the 1500s to position the text and isolate it. And that too is probably a reason for why we see so many significant artists in that century and the next century engaged with the Golden Ass in one way or another. So to bring this back to my early investment in MLA citation, when we start to dig into those categories, a number of things that might otherwise have passed us by suddenly become, I would say, quite significant to our understanding of the book that we're holding. Okay, so when we think about how we might represent this book, do we associate it with Apuleius? Well, to do that, we have to understand that this document is filtered through Monte Cassino revisions, there's listless revisions, there's really an unknown source in terms of, is it any one of three potential documents that may come first or later, as we look back at the 2nd century. When we look at something like the title that Graves provides us with, the Transformations of Lucius, otherwise known as the Golden Ass, that is a title that creates an intentional comparison between the original title of the document and also the comment from Augustine. So talk about confusing, right? So Graves is setting up a conflict in the title itself in terms of how we receive the text. We also need to be aware that the text we're reading is intentionally following on a period of censorship that relates to this document, how it is related through time. So there's an intentionality, arguably, in terms of what Graves is highlighting to push the document back out into what is now an atomic age kind of readership in the early 1950s. That's your text. That's the version that you have, which is one way of trying to argue that sometimes the context of a text is just as interesting as the document itself. Okay, or perhaps more interesting than the document itself. I don't know if that's true with the Golden Ass, which is an incredibly interesting document, but that's one thing to think about, all right, in terms of the work. So this is the end of a section that I'm thinking of as the story of the story. And again, hopefully here there are some notes that can be useful to you and for you in your conversations. And I think to just round this lecture out, okay, and again, I'll stop around 4:40, take questions if there are questions, is I want to just think about some very specific ways we can now engage with Graves' assessment of his own work. Okay, and I'll have to cut here a little bit for time, but there are a few things I want to point out. First, I want to point out this comment from Graves, which is really significant. He says, well, let me give a little context. All the modern translations stress that Apuleius' language is truly bizarre. His way of phrasing things, his way of saying things, his way of organizing words and presenting them. There are a number of intensely idiosyncratic phrases, at least in the received documents. Many modern translators have no idea what to do with this. Sarah Root, for example, struggles with it and is explicit about that in her translation. You need to understand that when you see something like this from Graves, why did Apuleius choose to write in this eccentric style? In my translation, I have made no attempt to bring out the oddness of the original Latin. That's not meant to suggest that the translation isn't any good, but it should draw your attention to the fact that Graves is not trying to represent that aspect of the document, how truly bizarre it is. Why is that significant? Well, when we think about the story that's being told and the audience it assumes, it raises all kinds of questions about, who is the audience that would have been receptive to such commentary, receptive to such writing? That's not Graves' concern. He's trying to make his document appealing to for him, a modern English-speaking audience. Okay, and you may get that sense as you move through the work. Real briefly, there are a few things that come up. One of the things that Graves says about his work is that if you look at it, slaves are always cowardly, wicked, deceitful, or treacherous. Now, I'm going to share a link to this PowerPoint with the preceptors because I can't represent this as well as I thought here. But if I actually look through the text, and what I've tried to do here is represent all the references to slaves of one kind or another in the document. There's over 100 references. If I was to look at these references individually, would it be reasonable to take from those observations the idea that slaves are always cowardly, wicked, deceitful, or treacherous? My answer to that is no. My answer to that, particularly those of you who are thinking about like the Festival of Laughter incident, when you see our narrator apparently abandoned, there are in most instances very good reasons for why he would be abandoned or for why somebody would not have his interest front and center. So there's this question of how slavery is represented in the text and what it means to be a slave. And I think that can be a really fascinating reading of the document, is to pay attention to that in some detail. So I'd argue with Graves a little bit about that. I don't know if you can see past my images here, but another thing we might think about is that Graves talks about this as being a religious text and that it communicates the idea that ill luck is catching. That is, if I look at the text, one of the things I'll see is that people have bad luck and other people have bad luck because they're associated with the person who originally had bad luck. I would argue that's also a pretty specific way to read the work. If you go back through the text and you look at instances where luck is mentioned, good or bad or ill, it's very hard to trace something out in the document that says that, well, this person had bad luck, so the next person had bad luck, and so on and so forth. The phrase ill luck only shows up once in the text. It shows up, I believe it's at in the conversation with Isis near the end. It's a peculiar way, I would say, to read the text. It's a peculiar way for Graves to read his own text. So we might ask, well, what supports the notion that bad luck can be catching? There are certainly instances in the text where bad luck has consequences, but the idea that people kind of carry bad luck with them, I would argue, is a debatable point that relates to the text. And then the last point I want to make here is this idea that one of the things the text is trying to teach us is that we should not meddle with the supernatural. that if we meddle with the supernatural, there will be very negative consequences. And again, if you look through the text for all the instances or many of the instances of supernatural occurrences, I would say that this is somewhat defensible, but it's hard to see it as an overriding theme. To kind of give you a sense of why I might say that rather than go into every example. The work ends with him meddling with the supernatural again, very intentionally, with the cult of Isis, right? But if I go back more broadly and I look at the document and I ask myself, is the sense that you should meddle with the supernatural significant? It is significant at different points, and there are individuals who encounter supernatural occurrences and it turns out very badly for them. But is that something the document is trying to teach me? Why is that important? Well, one of the things, this will be my concluding comment before your questions. One of the things that's maybe so crucial about the Golden Ass is the question of, well, what do we do with this? What do we do with this document? And when I look at Graves' text and his summation of his own work, he seems to be twisting himself into knots, trying to say, this is the reason why we should understand this text. This is the value that it communicates that we should learn from and grow with. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I also want to open you to the possibility that the document may not have a particularly set agenda for the value set it is trying to communicate to the readers. It may be that this is a text that is in part an effort to entertain, primarily, perhaps fundamentally. Now I say that and I can imagine a number of hands like shooting up out in Zoom meetings, because yes, we do have the Cupid and Psyche section right in the middle of this document. That's clearly a document that can be associated with Apuleius, and that would seem to have some very strong implications for notions of love and virtue and value that the document may want us to carry out from the document. We also have these comments in the text about how Apuleius, see, I'm doing it myself now, how the narrator in our story is a vehicle for people to learn about mythology and myths. I understand that as well. And that's obviously something that's significant to how this work unfolds. But do we need to rescue this document by ascribing it to or with a specific, socially acceptable value? Like this document is trying to teach me about spirituality and religion. Maybe. But at the end, we have to, I think, to get to that answer, we have to consider the document we have in our hands, and we have to consider the context that's relevant to that document. Okay. So I hope, I've cut a few things here. I hope that's useful for you or to you. And I'm very happy to entertain questions. I'll open up the chat so I can see a few. If I don't see it, or if you just want to mention it, I'm very happy to hear you as well. I haven't seen the chat questions yet, so I'll stop sharing my screen. That might be the best way to do this. And I'm very happy to take your questions, if there are any. I'll ask you some if no one asks me any questions.
I posted mine in the chat.
Okay, let me see. So thank you, Britton. So is it the one at the end here? Okay. There's a number of great questions here. Is there one of them you'd like me to draw from first, Britton?
Not really. I mean, I guess the second one with the satire.
How much of the satire? We draw almost, if not all of it. Yeah. So it's a great question, and we need to, I think we need to address that question. We need to come to some understanding of satire as a comedic form, okay, and the origins of that form and the development of that form. The key challenge with answering that question in terms of the document that Apuleius is producing is the question of reception. What we have in terms of evidence is a tradition, a scholarly tradition, as well as a general tradition, as we see with Augustine, of the document being associated with kind of the sensational work, okay, or the work that's designed to be first and foremost committed to exciting what are often described as kind of basic human emotions. We may interpret that kind of storytelling into modern notions of satire. So, is the goal here to satirize the Roman Empire? Is the goal here to satirize Christianity? There's a very standout. There's a very famous figure in this book that can be associated with Christianity. Is this an effort to satirize the poor? I think those are valid questions. But I think first and foremost, what we would ask ourselves is, well, what are the implications of what is being presented? What are the implications of the scene that I'm engaged with? Does it appear to be saying something constructive in terms of criticism, as it might be related to one group or another? That may be a value of the text. It may also be a value of the text that the text is simply trying to find scenarios that allow the author to get a quick emotional response from the reader. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but the concept of satire is itself so layered, and the concept of authorship and translation is so potentially confusing as it relates to this document. That's hard to give kind of I think it's half satire and half not satire. I think it's very significant if the document can be received as satire, okay? And that gets into issues of audience reception over authorial intention or expectations. So the document very productively could be viewed satirically. I think it's a very reasonable reading of the text, but the reasoning for that reading is probably quite modern. So the eyes that we're seeing it with, okay, might be eyes that are kind of trained to view things that may not have been visible or significant to early readers. And what to kind of throw my hands up in the air answer, I know what that is, kind of relates to the fact that we don't have other surviving works from the time that we can say, there's this literary tradition he's engaged with. We just, unfortunately, the documentation isn't there largely. It's not that we can't point to other works, other great writers, right? But in terms of the kind of narrative, kind of the long prose narrative involving a journey with these magical occurrences, that's not in a high style of like the Aeneid or the Odyssey. It's something that would have been produced, within the span of Apuleius' kind of mature adulthood. It's very hard to nail those things down. Okay. Thank you for the question.
I have a question. I'm sort of confused with why we're reading this, because I like after knowing the context, like it seems like it doesn't seem to necessarily have a strong like meaning. It seems kind of like just sort of a folktale. So why are we reading this, not just like a folktale collection?
I love that question. I think I can have an answer. It may not be the answer that you want, but I think I can have an answer. First of all, I'm very glad we're reading this text. Let's start with that. Second, Moriarty provides a literary critic. I didn't get to talk about it in the lecture. To pick up on your use of the word folktale, makes a very strong argument that this document kind of sits in between what he would refer to as the folktale, or what you might call the fairy tale, or the kind of general entertainment, kind of broadly accessible to people, and myth, that is the kind of culturally enshrined stories we tell ourselves about how the world operates that are often supernatural in nature. One of the things Arthur Fry says is these are basically the same thing structurally. When you look at what happens in these kinds of stories, fairy tales just simply tend to be myths that aren't yet valued significantly in society, or valued with respect to notions of how time and space operate. So when we look at something like the Golden Ass, we're looking at a document that is almost surely presented to entertain, but it's telling us a lot about second century Rome and how people may have chosen to be entertained if they could read, if they were in tune with the cultural issues of the day that are represented in this text. It's a very, I would say, gritty, street level reality check for everyone in the program, particularly after you walk out of the Aeneid and Vitruvius, which, as we discussed in my section, present these views of Rome that are grand and sterile and terrifying, and everything's organized so well. When I look at the Golden Ass, it's like I can hear an actual heartbeat in the civilization, as opposed to just see all the statues that are created for select groups associated with the civilization. So I would say works like this are very welcome in the honor sequence because they provide a conception of how the people of the day may have chosen to be entertained with narrative, with storytelling, with myth, and all those things come together in the Golden Ass. That's just my explanation. I'm not the one who I don't make all the selections here, but I would make that argument for its inclusion. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, I mean, like, how does this contrast to a folktale then, besides just being longer and having some mythology in it?
Well, we don't want to overlook the length in terms of prose construction, and we don't want to overlook the categorization of mythology in the text, like the intentionality, the pulling of myth from oral tradition into an organized narrative of extended length that would presumably be presented to people as an entertainment, something to read in isolation. This isn't like book 6 of the Aeneid, where you stand up and read it to Caesar, or one of the books, or one of the sections of the Odyssey, where there would be a grand public display. This is the literate class in isolation, kind of reading dirty stories, and that development for prose. The sense that these kinds of narratives, which present challenges to the state, perhaps quite explicitly, that are potentially quite critical of society in ways that you probably couldn't get away with publicly, the development of that kind of work is remarkable, and we see that tradition starting here. It's almost certainly the case that it did not start here, but in terms of the historical record, as we might conceive of long prose narratives, and please take that phrase with you, rather than say that I'm saying this is where it all begins for narration. So not long prose narratives in a conversational style, in an accessible style. This is as close to ground zero as the documentation will get us, in Rome anyway.
That makes sense.
Great question. Thank you. Seeing a question there about book burning. Does this book ever undergo any harsh changes to book burning because of what is portrayed? In terms of specific instances, I can't say that I can speak with certainty with specific instances, but I want to tell you something really quickly. Maybe this is super relevant, maybe to the banning of mouse and stuff like that that's going on right now. Something that is potentially much more devastating to a text than lighting it on fire is changing it and passing it on, modifying it and passing it on, so that what gets received is forever distinct from what was. And so when we look back at the tradition of the Golden Ass in the early 20th century, the idea that audiences would find material objectionable and that material would then be removed, which is what you guys were doing with your summations at the beginning of this lecture, and then allowed to continue in society, has far more terrifying implications for a text than banning it or burning it. Because then the question becomes, well, if the document is received as such and is never in the original, or the original is never addressed or redressed, then you have effectively done something much more significant to the document than burning it. But book burning is unimaginative in terms of how to destroy a narrative. Changing the text and passing it on is potentially quite a bit more destructive to the historical record. Other questions people want to present? Well, I know it's a rainy day and I know there's been a lot of snow, so let me just say how grateful I am to everybody for your time and attention. Again, and I thank you very much for your thoughtful questions. I hope I presented information that can be of use to you in your conversations or your understandings of the work. And I wish you all the best of luck as we continue to make our way through this semester. So thank you for the time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you.
Good luck for us to talk about in our preceptorials.
I do have still other questions.
Thank you.
I'll hang out and answer them. Have a good day. You as well. Okay, so I'm kind of seeing your questions there. You want me to go through? I'll go through the others here. So the question about readership, I think is a really good question in terms of target audience. We need, I think, to remove ourselves from like a late capitalist view of narrative production where Apuleius is trying to write like a bestseller and there are these tremendous production machines that allow that to occur. That's not what's happening. When we think about who's going to encounter the text, we can make some basic assumptions based on the kinds of people who are educated to read in second century Rome or in the geographies relevant to the document. The fact that this is the idea that scandalous behavior would be presented on as a play is certainly very not sensational in Rome. There's all kinds of stuff you can see on stage, right, in ancient Rome. So like the idea that sensational works would have to necessarily be hidden in a long prose narrative is probably not accurate. But this does appear to be an effort to provide some portability to that experience. So it's people who can read and it's people who have the time to reflect on the document. And as one of my students very usefully pointed out this morning, it also suggests people who have the leisure to be culturally aware of the many cultural references that emerge over the course of the narrative, the different kinds of people, different kinds of religious organizations and groups. So this is definitely a document for people who are at the time well versed in various religious traditions and versed in a way that makes them open to criticism and commentary on those documents. But yeah, I think fundamentally we want to keep in mind that this is not like global bestseller. This is much more like well, I can't say with certainty what it's much more like, but it's a document that would find its way into kind of select hands as it would be passed around. It's probably how it would be distributed in terms of scope. So it's hard to get very specific because the document's literary context is so hollow with respect to the historical record. You asked if it's more important to translate as literally as possible or if it's better to try to carry the meaning of the text. Well, it's not really for me to determine what's appropriate for a translation, but it is appropriate for every reader to reflect on the translation that they have and potentially the significant factors that shape the translation. Okay, so that's what I would say. So if we think about literal translations, most people who are familiar with more than one language would say that it's impossible to provide meaningful translations of documents if you're going to do a literal word for word translation because linguistic conventions vary so dramatically between even very similar languages. So a literal translation, to the extent that it could occur, is also potentially super deranging with respect to our ability to understand what the text is communicating in its original language. So that may not be a value that's particularly meaningful. But then your other question about is it better to try and carry the meaning of the text forward is a very good one. And different translators will value meaning in different ways, and the publishers will value meaning in different ways. So that's why, it's one of the reasons why I think when we consider the investment in the document, who's putting it into the world and why is significant. So it's not that Graves' translation is bad. It's not. It's that we can think about it with a lot of specificity. Unfortunately, because of the way things work out, we can think about it with a lot more specificity than we can Apuleius' actual writing. But again, that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it is what it is, which is true of any version of the document you might engage with. And then to your final question about the Streisand effect, more trying to hide or censor something only increases notoriety. I don't know. I think that we are lucky enough. How do I phrase this? So it's a nice thought. It's nice to imagine that censorship doesn't really work. When I think it's probably much more reasonable to understand that censorship almost certainly does work. Threats to documents, films, music are not to be dismissed lightly. Stephen King has a tweet this week. I enjoy Stephen King reading very much. I disagree with this tweet very much. His reading of Mouse is that it doesn't matter if it's banned because everyone's going to go to Amazon and buy it. Well, that assumes you have money to buy it. That assumes you have access to Amazon. That assumes that you are an adult incapable of understanding what you're being denied. It doesn't seem to take into consideration that lots of people are dependent on cultural authorities for the documentation they receive and enjoy. And those are precisely the people who are going to get trampled when documents are censored, when documents are removed. So something like the Streisand effect, I would say that it's not real because it does drive interest in the moment, but the long-term implication isn't in the moment when something is banned. It's over time. It's the long game. If it's harder and harder to get access to the golden ass, if it's harder and harder to get access to Mouse or any other text, then that's exactly what it means. It's harder and harder to get access to it and the ideas that are in the document. So when we encounter censorship or efforts to censor, we need to take those efforts very, very seriously because the people who are perhaps less fortunate than you or I are quite probably the people who are going to be the most impacted by that decision. So we need to take that seriously if we're going to be invested in education and the communication of ideas across time. So that's how I would answer that. Does that help address your questions?
Yeah, I think so. Like, it's definitely one of those topics it's like you could probably talk about for a very long time.
I think so. I agree with you.
Adam, just a quick question. Would you have chosen another version yourself?
Well, I don't know if I necessarily would have because I think this text is so instructive in terms of what it is. Like, I think this is a great way to be exposed to these ideas. And if I was encountering a text that was throwing up errors in respect of how official and how well translated it was and was not so easy to kind of see around, I probably wouldn't walk away aware of the translation issues that would be just as significant to that document as they would be to the Graves version. So I think it's a really good selection. Just like I think the Fagles selection of the Odyssey is a really smart move in the sequence. Not because it's as idiosyncratic as Graves, but because the Fagles translation does an awful lot to make you aware of what you're reading because it invites you in so effectively.
Yeah, I was just wondering. Robert Graves is a very good storyteller in his own right. He can't really keep himself out of the golden ass, although he claims he did in his introduction. But I don't know if that's some ironic play there because he's very present.
Yeah, he is in ways that are productive. I mean, there's jokes that
yeah. Well,
if I might kind of interject my own thoughts there, I think it's kind of nice to do that because, especially with something as complex as this, it's impossible almost to give an unbiased reading or translation of it. Like you said, it seems like a lot of people who've done this have had to go through just so much education to even be able to do it. That there's probably a lot of knowledge and prejudice and experiences there that are going to change, how you perceive what the meaning to be in the first place, regardless if you want to follow close to that or translate literally.
Well, thank you, Dr. Crowley, for giving such a fantastic lecture and joining us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dr. Crowley. So much more we could talk about, but we'll cut it off there because it's 5 o'clock on a grim afternoon. But
everybody drives safe.